Today we are going to change out the timing belt in my 2002 Mazda Miata. Let's speedrun the process of replacing the timing belt. Pull out the e-brake, put the car in gear, chalk the wheel, put this puck on the jack stand, jack up the car from the subframe in the middle, gun from the wheel. The puck will decrease the damage on the subframe. Grab a jack stand. It also needs an attachment so it can go on the pinch weld. This attachment right here, I will link it down below. It goes on those ridges because it's rear end first. Now lower the car. Safety check the car while it's jacked up. Now we need to remove the radiator and drain it. To do that, we need to remove the plastic underneath. So we have 10 millimeters all around this plastic piece, 3 in the front, 2 in the back, and a few on each side of the rear wheel. You need some extensions to reach them because some of them are pretty deep in there. And now you just yank that sucker out. Grab your favorite bucket, maybe not your favorite, because we are draining the coolant. So you need to grab that hose, grab that with pliers, remove the hose clamp, and pull out that hose, and it will drain out. Footage just got deleted. Grab the 8 millimeter and remove the intake coupler clamp. Remove this hose, and if it's stuck, you can grab some pliers and yank it like that, and it should break loose the seal. Remove this 10 millimeter, remove this clip. And now you can finally take out the air intake. Now let's remove the top hose on the radiator. Same deal. This one might be pretty stuck because it just gets pretty crusty. So take some time, be patient, and let it splash all over your camera lens and yourself. Unplug both fans. Remove the clips that's keeping it to the shroud. I'll link the tool down below as well for your convenience. We need to remove the braces keeping the radiator in. I put the bolts back just so I don't lose them. Now let's grab a 12 millimeter and remove the strut braces. And I'm putting back all the bolts I can so I don't lose them because there will be a lot of bolts. Now just remove the radiator, probably the easiest radiator remove I've ever done. Now I have so much room for games and fun, but we're not doing much fun because we need to remove the valve cover. Yay! We need to remove the spark plugs. To do that, we need to move these 10 millimeters, set aside the coil packs, unplug the other stuff. You might break them, so be careful. Now let's remove the 10 millimeter holding in this wire. Undo that hose, undo the plug in the back. Now we have this banjo bolt that's a 19 millimeter we need to remove. So go ahead and yank that bolt right out. It will have 2 copper washers on both sides, so make sure you remove the copper washers while your camera is falling on top of the valve cover. Now let's remove this 10 millimeter holding in this bracket that's holding in some wires. Undo the valve cover. Now let's remove the valve cover with all these 10 millimeters. Preferably start from the middle, go on out in a clockwise direction, and the valve cover should come right out with a lot of wiggling. Now we need to break loose these 10 millimeters on the water pump. So break loose those bolts while the pulleys are still attached. But to do that, let's go ahead and remove these hoses because they are kind of in our way and they are annoying. Now before we remove the auxiliary belt, we need to go ahead and break loose the crank bolt. Sounds scary, but it's really not that bad. This sway bar is in the way, so go ahead and move the 10 millimeters on the sway bar. There's 2 on each side, and the sway bar should just fall right down. All right, go ahead and break loose these for 10 millimeters first while the pulley is still attached. In order to remove the belt, we need to loosen this power steering pump with a 12 millimeter. Go ahead and break loose this nut and this nut with a 10 millimeter. You can go ahead and loosen up this bolt. But in order to fully loosen up the power steering pump, we need to spin the crank so the pulley can spin just enough so we can get that last bolt. But for it to be easier to spin, we need to move the spark plugs, all 4 of them, so it will not have any more pressure. But as a shortcut, you actually don't need to spin the crank. You just need to break loose this 14 millimeter in the back of the power steering pump. You do not need to access it from the front just yet. And then you now have room to move the auxiliary belt. Now we need to do the same thing to the alternator belt. Break loose this bolt, break loose the bolt on the bottom of it. Now we need to loosen the tensioner, which you can do by hand when you break it loose. Push it upwards and remove the belt. There are miscellaneous clips and plugs that you need to undo. And with those 3 10 millimeters, we can now remove the top of the timing belt cover. Now let's go ahead and fully remove that water pump pulley. Now we have access to the rest of the bolts to the middle of the cover. This cover is broken down into 3 pieces and they're all held in by 10 millimeters. So go ahead and move those 2 bolts that's holding on the middle piece. And in order to get the last bottom piece, we need to remove the crankshaft pulley. And in order to remove that pulley, it will take some patience, a little bit of small love taps with a hammer. Be very careful, you're hammering on the crank, so don't hit hard at all. So you can remove these 10 millimeters, but I forgot that you need to remove this last shielding, which I sprayed with WD-40 to make the job just a little bit easier, and it made it significantly easier. So spray it with WD-40 from the very beginning and you won't have that much issue. Now we can yank off the bottom of the timing cover. Put the car in 5th gear. Now pull the e-brake. So now have your best friend, and in this case my wife, press on the brakes while you break loose this crankshaft bolt. I use a 5/8.
Oh, that was much easier than I expected. Oh my gosh.
Now we need to put the car in TDC, top dead center. And to do that, we need to align all these white marks with these lines right here that's on the block itself. And on the bottom, there's a little notch that we need to line up as well. So we need all that to line up at the same time. So go ahead and spin the crank after you take the car out of gear and remove the e-brake so it'll be easier to spin, and put it on that notch. Bam, and we're on that notch. And we are lined up. Now we need to grab this special tool that will keep the timing in place while we remove the belt. Also, it will be linked down below. So go ahead and place this within the gearing notches on both of the gears, and it will keep it in place. There you go. Now we can get on to the job. So go ahead and re-break loose that nut, which should be a lot easier. Quick old yank after you put the car in gear. Remove that bolt, spray some WD-40. Now we need to move this last piece. And it comes right off because we sprayed with WD-40. If you want to keep that key in there, you do not want to remove it. Now let's go ahead and remove the first tensioner on the top left. Break that loose and remove it all the way. Break loose the tensioner to the right. They are kind of tight, so use a little bit of elbow grease or a longer breaker bar. And now we can slide the timing belt right off. So this is the old timing belt compared to the new timing belt, which I bought from Gates. Very reputable brand. This is the brand you should be buying. And you can definitely tell that the old one's old and new one's new. It is discolored, and when you pick them up side by side, you can see the toothing on the outside of the timing belt, which is indication that it's time to replace the timing belt. And of course it comes with new pulleys, and while we're doing this job, we need to replace the water pump since we're already in here. So go ahead and move that 10mm on the far left of the water pump, which is holding in the alternator. There are two 12mm holding in the inlet to the water pump on this right side. Move that hosing to make it a little bit easier. Top and bottom. A little tight, but not too bad. And now go ahead and give it a little hammering and it'll open up right up. Now remove the last three 10mm. Let's go ahead and remove this spring, keep it to the side because we are going to use that rubber casing. Now pull the water pump right out. Now I knew this water pump had a slight leak because it was wet right down here, I forgot to mention earlier, which is why I was losing coolant. Go ahead and clean the mating surface with a plastic scraper. You can opt to use a metal scraper, but that would be very dangerous because you don't want to gouge the surface. Like on this housing to the right, that was very hard to remove. So I went ahead and used some oven degreaser to make it a little bit easier, which it helped a little bit, but I had to break out the metal scraper and be very careful to not gouge it. And it is super clean now. Now go ahead and add some gasket maker on the water pump itself so it'll keep the water pump gasket in place. Add that rubber piece on top and put it right in. It wedges up underneath the galley on the top, so don't forget about that, and we can start adding the bolts in place, just finger tight for right now. Go ahead and torque them to spec. Now go ahead and slide this gasket in between the galleyway, and while you're sliding it in, hold it in place and place in the top bolt, then place in the bottom bolt and make sure the gasket is in place correctly. Now these are the pulleys from the timing belt, and the old one spins freely. It shouldn't be spinning freely. So out with the old and in with the new. Hand tighten it, then torque it to spec. It'll be on the screen. Now go ahead and place the bolt in, just finger tight for right now. Add the spring, the new spring with the old cover. Go ahead and tighten up the alternator, torque that to spec. Now slide the tensioner all the way to the left and tighten it as far as you can. Now we can grab the new belt, which is a T179 from Gates. Place it on the crank first. Make sure all the teeth line up. Pull it tight, add the plate on. Go ahead and tighten the crankshaft bolt. Feed it through the right gear, all while going around that tensioner on the bottom. And once you have it in place, you can use a zip tie. I made a mistake, not a huge mistake, but a mistake nevertheless I do want to talk about before we move on. So I took the car out of gear to make this easier to spin so I can put it in TD. Right, when I was putting the belt on, not fully put on yet, I accidentally moved that out of TD. So I need to take out the belt, spin it to TD, so we're not spinning any of this, and then move on from there. Spun it back to TD. With that fiasco fixed, go ahead and place it back on there, tying it with a zip tie just so it won't come loose, and pull it tight on the left side as well. It might not be super tight initially, but it will get tight after you put the belt around the tensioner on the left side, which is why we try to push as far left as possible. So use some elbow grease, twist it, get the belt on that tensioner. All right, we can move that zip tie. There are two ways to make sure that you're doing this correctly. There should be 19 teeth between both north-facing pillars on these, and there are 19 here. Go ahead and loosen this tensioner because we need to spin the crank 2 full rotations at least to make sure everything is in timing correctly and to tension the motor correctly. So after 2 passes at least, you can do more if you want to, make sure all the timing marks are still lined up appropriately, and we are good. We can torque this tensioner to spec. And we can, for good measure, spin the crank a few more times to make sure everything lines up correctly. The second way to check if you did the timing belt correctly is to press the timing belt down with moderate pressure and make sure it's between 9 to 11 millimeters of deflection. Now we need to torque the crank back to spec, and we need to make sure that the e-brake's pulled up, it's in 5th gear, and our best friend is holding the brake. Now we can go ahead and add these covers, which goes in the same way we removed them. So go ahead and add them all. After all the covers are added, we can now install this pulley. So go ahead and place in the shielding and install the pulley. Place in the 4 10mm bolts by hand at first. Do the same with the water pump. While you're here, you can go ahead and plug in that plug and put it back into its mating spot. You add these hoses back. Now the smaller auxiliary belt goes between the alternator and the other 2 pulleys. After the pulley teeth are all lined up, we can now tighten the tensioner on the alternator and tighten the other 2 bolts. Go ahead and tighten it until you can only do a 1/4 turn on the belt, on the auxiliary belt, and that is good for me. So we can tighten the other bolts. Now let's go ahead and install the last auxiliary belt. Tension the belt in the same exact way, and after you can only get 1/4 turn, you can tighten the other bolts, and you might have to spin the crank in order to gain access to the bottom bolt of that power steering pump, which is located right here. Go ahead and place a wrench on the back and tighten it from the front. Now we can tighten to spec the water pump bolts. Now let's go ahead and do the valve cover. So we need to go ahead and clean out the mating surface on the block itself. The plastic scraper is perfect here. Make sure you remove all the leftover RTV from the previous job, because if you leave it, it will leak. That is one hard and brittle gasket. This valve cover gasket is very brittle and crusty. It's very stiff, so this job probably hasn't been done in a while. So I'm glad I'm doing it. Go ahead and clean that galley with I use a flathead to get in between the galley and everything, and I made sure I removed every particle I could because I did not want it to leak. And now you can install the fresh new gasket, which is very nice. Now we need to add a nice beaded RTB silicone gasket onto every corner crevice on the block, essentially. So add a nice bead. Don't add way too much because it can get in the valve, and you don't really want that. It won't be in the motor, but you don't want to add too much. Just add just enough into each galley. Now we can go ahead and install the valve cover itself. Be sure not to jock the gasket and make sure everything lines up properly, and don't smudge the gasket maker RTV too much. Just get it right in the right spot. That's all you gotta do. Be patient. It's not that hard, but be patient. Go ahead and install all the valve cover bolts, all the 10mm from the outside to the middle. Don't tighten them too much here. Just get them almost where they're above hand tight. Now we can torque them all to spec, starting from the middle and going clockwise. After that, we need to go ahead and grab this banjo bolt, add the copper washer, put the banjo bolt in through, and while you're pushing it through, slide in that other copper washer, and then just torque that sucker to spec. Now let's go ahead and install all the spark plugs. Don't over tighten them, and then we can install the coils. Just go ahead and slide in the radiator because that's what's next. Install its brackets. Go ahead and plug in the fans and whatever other fans that you need to get. Install the both pipings back into its inlets and outlets, both hoses, install the intakes, and now it's time to bleed the system. So go ahead and top it off with coolant, the appropriate Asian Miata coolant. And to do it properly, you need to kick over the motor, wait until it gets up to operating temperature, and then when it gets to operating temperature, the thermostat will open and will gulp up more coolant. Moment of truth. It's always a little nerve-wracking, although you are 100% positive that you did everything right. Now we gotta start up the car and bleed the coolant system. I forgot this plug right here. I kick over the car, turn the heat all the way on, and let that bleed all the way through. And you're done. You have officially done your first timing belt on your Miata, or maybe second or third or fifth one. Good job. Everything linked down below for your convenience. Bye.